Yes, my name is Scott Elnes. I am meteorologist at Central Oregon Daily News. My job doesn't require a teleprompter, so I just talk until somebody tells me to shut up. So I'm just going to start kind of a timer. I'm just going to talk a little bit about career path and then about my own mental health struggle that I had at a younger age, and then oftentimes people like to ask me questions like, is Alan Schauffler really a jerk? That kind of stuff. So, which he's not, just for the record. I am, in fact, a meteorologist. I know a lot of people, when I've been doing this for years, they say, well, you're on TV, you're not a real meteorologist. But in fact, I did graduate from Mississippi State University, about 6 months difference than Darrell Winninger, the chief meteorologist. So he and I are essentially classmates. And though we have very different forecasting styles, I watch him, all due respect to Bob Shaw, I always watched Darrell before to get my weather when I was coming on. So when I told him that, we became pretty fast friends. So meteorology is a passion of mine, but most people then say, well, you're obviously a science nerd, which was only true about into my late 20s, I guess, is when I really started to get turned on to science. I was a musician for most of my life, and that's how my first attempt at making a living was as a musician. That will be part of my discussion about mental health, was my music career. So I started out as a musician and spent many, many years doing that. In fact, I pursued it probably much longer than one should logically do so, and then became very interested in space. And that then eventually led to some interest in science. I was doing an audition for an infomercial in Seattle. Being a guitar player, but at the time had long hair and all this stuff, and they said, "Gosh, you're really not the look that we want for this commercial, but you're good on camera. Have you ever done that before?" And I said, "No, I've been fronting a band and stuff." But as I walked out, I had this literal light bulb moment as I looked down the street at King TV in Seattle and said, "Man, the guy that's the meteorologist at the ABC affiliate lives near me. He's one of the happiest guys I know. He's one of the nicest guys I know. I bet you I could learn about weather." And so 3 days later, I was an intern at KOMO in Seattle and was enrolled in meteorology school. So this was a musician, weatherman type of a shift. So I always go, people, it's a natural progression from, meteorologist or from a musician to meteorologist. But it was one of the best decisions I ever made. One of the weirdest decisions I ever made was to answer a call to go to Anchorage, Alaska as my first job. The reason that was so weird is because I spent 9 seasons in the seafood industry, in the slime lines, for 15 hours a day, cutting up fins and smelling like fish for months at a time. And I remember the summer before I took the job, I was watching their weather person, and the person there with me said, "That person's horrible, you should go do that." And I said, "I'm never coming back to Alaska again after this." And then about 6 months later, they made me an offer at the #1 station in Anchorage, and I decided to go ahead and do it. Didn't think much about the fact that as a Seattleite at the time, I hadn't seen like 20 degrees maybe my entire life, and it was 20 degrees as the high in Anchorage when I was going to be moving up there and getting into the single digits. So I was petrified moving to Alaska permanently, because I moved there in November, which is typically actually one of the months where it gets really sunny and gets really, really cold. So I was, it was a baptism by ice, I guess would be the way to put it. I did life-changing piece of advice my boss gave me after about 2 winters there. They have winters for about 7 months in Anchorage, and he said, if you don't learn to do something in the outdoors in the winter, you're going to go nuts. And so I took up cross-country skiing, and now that's literally one of the reasons I moved here, was because we have about 6 months of cross-country skiing. Alaska turned me into a hardcore outdoorsman. I am out cross-country skiing, hiking, playing disc golf almost every day, because I get off work at about 8 in the morning, up at 2:30 in the morning every day. So it's kind of turned me into a big outdoorsman. In Anchorage, I was able to do a job where I would do the weather, and then on the weekends I would travel and do adventures. And one of the highlights of that was a 3-night, 4-day dog mushing adventure through the Denali Wilderness area with my own 6 dogs and a couple of guides. And the first day was a balmy 15 below zero. Thankfully, we were dressed well, which if you've been in a cold environment, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing choices, which I'm about to contradict, but it's fairly true. First day, the balmy 15 below. Next day, 30 below. Third day, 40 below. And the last day was 45 below on the back of a dog sled. And at that point, I had all the right clothing, but I actually got so cold I lost sensation in the tip of my toes for about 6 weeks. But it did return. I didn't get frostbite, but it was kind of touch and go at that point. Alaska really got me into the outdoors, into community. And when I moved back to Seattle in the middle of the economic crash, which against everybody's advice, I was able to get a job doing some weather in Seattle, but also then got out of the business and started doing, I was a producer at Xbox, all the kids and their video games, and of course what was I at the time? I was in my mid-40s and I was the old guy, on the team. So it was kind of an interesting transition. That's when the paychecks were much better than they are in TV these days, and I thought that was going to be kind of that's my ticket. Well, I learned pretty fast that doing a creative job for a major corporation is not particularly creative because everything you do has to go through a legal department. And pretty soon I realized that the paycheck wasn't worth the stress that I was taking on. And it was at that point that I came here to visit a friend who'd been coming up to visit me in Alaska. And I came back and I said, well, wait a second. This is a rain shadow. I should have known about this. I kept thinking Oregon, it's going to be raining all the time, but it's sunny here. This is really cool. And then I looked, Deschutes Brewing, Mirror Pond was like one of my favorite beers when I was doing music. So all of a sudden, every visit started getting a little bit more sucked into Bend. It really felt like the first place I'd ever considered, like it felt like home to me, and Seattle never had my whole life. So then, like most Microsoft employees, you get laid off, and I said, I'm heading for Bend. Managed to, when I was in Bend and I was trying to decide if I was going to come, I decided to go for the river walk. And while I was out there, managed to find the apartment that I could move into as I was on the walk, and I managed to find a job where I took over a small production company, video production company, and for about 3 years was the one that did all the Robertson Ford TV commercials and was a producer there. That life got really difficult because it's, income goes like this. And when COVID hit, the production everything collapsed. Nobody wants to be in a room shooting video when there's a pandemic going on. Thankfully, about that time, I'd noticed that Samantha O'Connor had come from KTVZ, who was one of the best anchors I'd ever seen. Then Matt McDonald, who was the anchor at KTVZ when I moved here, came back to town, so I started to kind of get on the radar there. And then Alan Schaffler, who was an anchor in Seattle when I was coming up, came here, and I said, I need to get involved with this organization. I never thought I'd get back into TV because this is literally one of the smallest markets in the country, so it's not like you're getting the fame and fortune that everybody thinks you're going to get. So I started out as a substitute meteorologist and then did some stories and did some weekend weather. And when COVID hit, the GM said, what do you need? What do you need to stay alive? How many hours do you need in order to stay afloat? And I said, well, give me 20 hours and I'll continue to do as much contract work as I could. I taught meteorology to kids online. And then one day they said, we're going to start a morning show and we want you to take over. And I thought, ooh, I get to go up head to head with Bob Shaw, who I'd been watching all these years. Got nothing bad to say about Bob. Bob has accomplished something that I dream of doing, is to be in the same community for all these years. I have a great deal of respect for him. I'm looking forward to making it more advantageous for him to retire soon, but I have a great deal of respect for what he does. In doing that, we did launch the morning show just a little over a year ago, and as I said, it's a 2:30 a.m. alarm clock, which you never really quite get used to that. It always feels like, how did somebody put it? It feels like you're jet lagged all the time is kind of the way it works out. In this job, they finally said, we need you to do a story every week because only half my job is doing the weather. And so in going out and kind of adventuring around, I stumbled upon Billy Chinook. And I had always heard Bob talk about Lake Billy Chinook, and I thought, he was obviously a person, but I didn't really know anything about him until I was in Shevlin Park hiking, and it said he was traveling with Kit Carson and John Fremont, and they came through Fremont Meadow and Shevlin Park. So I went into Matt's office, who's the big boss, and said, I've got this idea about doing stories about things I didn't know. And he said, that's great. I think that's a great idea. What's it called again? Little did you know? I said, no. I want my ignorance to be on display. So it's little did I know is the way the segment has panned out. The Billy Chinook one was a very fascinating story. I'll just share a couple of the more fascinating stories that I've had to uncover here, because Billy was originally born with the native name Geigo. His father's name was Geigo, and before Billy was born, his entire village, except for his mother and a slave girl, was wiped out by smallpox. So they decided to go to Uncle Wasco, who was part of the leader of the Wasco tribe. So they started to make their way there, and his mother died en route. So the slave girl took Billy, and for, I can't remember the exact length of time, but they were out for quite a while before they made it to where the Wascos were. And the slave girl decided, I'm just going to say this is my kid. So he was raised as Geigo, and when she took sick and was on her deathbed, she finally confessed to the chief that this is your nephew. So the chief said, I have to adopt this kid, but the Chief Wasco's wife was none too pleased that this new kid there, so he was treated very poorly by his mother. So when John Fremont came through, he immediately said, oh, they need a guide, or they need somebody who can track, who can hunt, and he immediately raised his hand. He was a kid that was very, very curious. Ironically called, Billy Chinook. He was staying with a Chinook family, but he was not a Chinook Indian. So that's just kind of par for the course back then, that it was just sort of assumed that he was of that tribe. And he did travel with Fremont and Kit Carson throughout. They ended up in Dillon Falls at one point, and then at Shevlin Park, and mapped a lot of the Northwest in the 1800s, and eventually he became a valued tribal member and passed away many, many years ago. But I was able to interview his great-grandson for the story, so that was a fun one. The other one that fascinated me was, have you guys ever heard of the Blue Basin? Anyone ever heard of that before? It's out near Painted Hills. And I love Painted Hills, one of my favorite places. But there's this place where the rocks are blue. And so I went out to cover this story, and while I was out there, I saw a sign that said, it was talking about John Day. Well, little did I know, John Day actually never was in the John Day area. He has an entire city, river, areas all named after him, but how he came to be was he was with a group that was heading towards what became Astoria, and he fell sick. They decided to keep going without him, and they left him with one other person. So as he was trying to recover, some Indians mistook them for some people that did a raid on their village. And so they came there, robbed them of all their possessions, literally stripped them naked, and then left them there to die. And so John and his friend thought, well, this is it, we're done. And while they were standing near the river mouth of what would be John Day meeting the Columbia, some trappers came by, found them, and rescued them. So John Day's, there's two John Day rivers for one. One of them is the one that we know of. John Day essentially never spent any time actually in the John Day river, or in the John Day area, which really was quite fascinating to me that he would get that name for such a thing. But another one of the ones that people don't know about is, there's a piece of moon rock, or there's a piece of volcanic rock from Central Oregon on the moon right now. There was actually a time when they were training astronauts to wear the suits to train for going to the moon. This was back in the 60s, and they paired everybody up with a man in the community to kind of be their friend and get them through. And a local Bend man was paired with a guy who eventually, I believe, got onto Apollo, I believe it was 14. I'm not certain about that. And so he sent him a little piece of volcanic rock and said, is there any chance you can take this to the moon with you? And he heard nothing. And the guy went to the moon, came back months later, still nothing. And then one day he got a picture of this guy on the moon and a little circle with a little black rock. And he actually took a little piece of volcanic rock and put it on the moon, where it's sitting to this day. So I found that to be just, especially as a space geek, that's me. I was absolutely fascinated by that. And the last one of little I know I'll share is the stories that are within the stories, and this is something that I find interesting in life, is I went to go do a story about the box factory. Well, it was a box factory. That's what they did it for. So I went to go interview a woman at the museum, and she said, well, it began back in the lumber days, and they needed boxes were the way everybody shipped things, and they were all wooden boxes. And then when the war came, World War I, it was all women then who came in and ended up working through the box factory. And then when the men came back, it was actually about 50-50. The women stayed on and helped keep the box factory alive through all those years. And that was a story that I didn't anticipate telling when I went in to tell the original story. So my story shifted to the women of the box factory, not the history of the box factory. And I've had many stories where I went in thinking there was one story, and then suddenly there was a better story that was deeper, and I found that to be kind of translate into just regular life too. When you talk to people, you find out a lot of times there are more fascinating stories underneath the surface. So that's been a large part of my travels is finding out things that I don't know and then doing stories about them. In fact, my cue is if somebody tells me something, I go, what? That's probably going to become a story. So it's very, very fun. Other than the 2:30 a.m. alarm clock, it's one of the best jobs you can have. I get paid to talk about a subject I'm in love with, meteorology, and then do stories, and I get to work from home from that. And so it's a really neat lifestyle for an outdoorsman like me. I get to go up midweek when nobody else is up at the mountain and do all my outdoor activities. In transitioning over to mental health, in reference to, like I did a story about this, my musical past, when I first graduated college and I moved back to Seattle, this was back when, do you guys remember hearing about the grunge era in Seattle? This was right before that. And I managed to, through chance, meet a guy who's a drummer for a band that was called Inflatable Soul, and he had the lead singer and two sisters, last name of Cornell, which was the lead singer of Soundgarden, one of the most successful bands out of Seattle, who also sadly succumbed to suicide a handful of years ago. That was the brother and two sisters of this guy. So we took off. We were becoming one of the biggest bands in the area. We were selling out clubs everywhere, and I was not the main songwriter, but I was the arranger, the one that kind of helped us become what we had become. So at the peak, we were opening for pretty major names, playing in front of 3,000, 4,000 people. And then the day before I was to go to Hawaii on my first vacation in 2 years, the lead singer showed up at my house and said, I want you out. Never saw it coming. It was absolute shock because I had really, I had even gotten us on the radio. I had gone to the radio station myself, even though I was just a bass player in the band, and they had started playing our songs. So I went off to Hawaii. Thankfully, my best friend was there with me. I could only characterize those 7 days as being heavy drinking is the best way I could describe what happened there. But I had my best friend with me. The shock was still very, very fresh when I came back to Seattle. And I came back on a Saturday, was driving in my car, and the band I was in was on the radio. And I was suddenly filled with these visions of them becoming multimillionaires and touring around the world and becoming what I had always dreamed of becoming. I'd been a musician since I was 11. And so I got up Sunday morning, I grabbed a toothbrush and a jacket, I went off to church to see my parents, left a note, and I drove off to a fjord just near the Gorge Amphitheater, which is in central Washington. We had shot a video there the previous year, and I went there with the intention of, at the very least, facing down the demon that was in my head, if not deciding to take myself off this planet. I even remember one of the low points was driving to the place and seeing a semi-truck and just thinking if there's any way he could blow a tire and make it easy for me. I'm horribly afraid of heights, so going to a fjord was not maybe the greatest thing to do, but it was about a 300-foot fall, and I found myself at the site where we had filmed this video, and I had thought I was about to accomplish all my dreams. And I like to say that I stood at the edge, but I'm so afraid of heights that I was literally on my knees saying, just give me the strength to throw myself off. At that point, I was raised, excuse me, in a religious family. I'm a spiritual guy. I've studied all the major religions in the world. I didn't feel like, it didn't turn me into an atheist. My feeling was there is some kind of creator out there, and it has it in for me, which is worse. That now I'm going to be living the rest of my life this way. This isn't going to work. Thankfully, I have great family. I had a mentor that was a minister at a church that I grew up in, and he had told me one time, don't ever let the good get in the way of the great. And something in that stuck in my head. And so I thought, I'm going to step back from this. I'm going to give it a few days. I spent 3 days alone in the desert, and then finally said, I need to go back, and I'm on probation. Life is on probation. I got back. I'm living with the drummer in the band that I was in and seeing them starting to move forward when I discovered a book that was for a music school in Los Angeles. I thought, maybe if I can get the money, I can go do this. And just happened to be that my brother, who had worked in a cannery in Kodiak, Alaska, couldn't go up one year. So he asked if I wanted to go up there and spend the next 4 months once again in the middle of what I consider my hell, and do fish processing again. And I don't recommend to anybody, or for most people, that when you're dealing with that you're still suicidally depressed, that you go yourself into a salmon cannery. But I had a wonderful mentor. Like I said, we would write back and forth, and he would help me begin to get perspective. And at the point that I finally left there after 4 months, I worked 3 months and 29 days of the 4 months that I was there, so oftentimes 12 to 17 hours a day. After that, I then took off for music school, and my life started to rebuild. Now, a couple of things that I learned from that. First of all, there's kind of two forms of depression that I was made aware of. One of them is what I experienced, which was a situational depression. I was hit with something that I didn't see coming that was very valuable to me, and it hurt. But that's what I suffered, was the situational. The other one that I have no experience to talk to is chemical. So they're very, very different states of depression. And so if you know anyone who has a chemical situation, that's a very different approach. There needs to be a completely different situation. But for me, my mentor pointed out, this is just what happened in the overall spectrum of things. You're going to be able to rebound. You're going to be able to rebuild your life. And I put myself on a road to go back and start rebuilding again. And it wasn't easy. I never did reclaim the level of fame that I had gotten in the music business before. But the two things that I got out of it, the first one was I learned that when you're depressed at the level that I was, you can't make it get better just instantly. It's like a broken arm. You can't just say, I want my arm to be better. It's going to be better. There's going to be a healing process that's going to take time. I've come to find, for me, I've had two now situations that were that way. It takes about 6 months of just sticking it out, sticking your head down and getting your way out. The second half of the first one is that depression can become a nice warm jacket. It can be something where if you feel like you've been victimized by this earth, then you're not responsible for anything anymore. You can always blame it on the fact that you're depressed or that life has treated you badly. And so for me, it became a balancing act of not trying to push things too far, but also not trying to give into self-pity any more than I had to. So thankfully, like I said, through years, and a lot of it was through spending time alone in the woods. I mainly went internal. I never did go to a professional, though many of my friends have. I was able to, over a couple of years, come out. But the other thing that came out of it that was so valuable to me was I learned to be grateful. That was the number one thing that came out of this, because every 3-4 years I go back to the bottom of that fjord. I paddle out on my kayak and I go, this is where I could have ended up. If I had lived the life that I thought needed to be lived, this is where I would be. So since I didn't end up there, it's now my life to make decisions for. So I chose a very different path. I never have married and have always... I've traveled to Sri Lanka for some elephants. I've made India for some elephants and wildlife. So I've had a very substantial life because I chose that I was going to make the rules myself, because otherwise I would end up there. So gratitude became such a huge part of my recovery and my continued life. In fact, a lot of people, when they see how, like, I'm in at 3:30 every morning, and I'm the one that's always smiling, and you must be drinking a lot of caffeine. It's like, no, I don't have coffee until like the second hour. You know, I feel very grateful, and I heard many of you say this, I'm just glad to be here. You know, I'm just glad to have gotten out of bed. And, you know, I'm now in my mid-50s. I was in my mid-20s when this happened, and I can honestly say that at some level every day there's a level of gratitude that I'm still here, that I'm still breathing, and it has made, I would never want to go back through that experience. I think if I could, I would claim just take the ignorance. But it was a situation that I think it transformed me into a person that is far more patient. I was a very impatient young man, and far more grateful for everything. Now when I get out into the mountains, I never get tired of it. I never get tired of seeing the stars. I never get tired of being out in such a place where we have such amazing outdoor and nature connections. So for me personally, in dealing, when life gets rough, I generally go alone. I generally go off into the woods, and I sort through to find the answers myself. Oftentimes I use friends and counselors, you know, friends that have known me to give me their ideas, but then I take it and this is where I find my answers from here on out. So it's something I'd never want to have to go through again, but it really has completely changed the way I approach my life, and that's ultimately why I'm here. I am here for mental health. I could have gone to much larger markets. In fact, at one time I was in Seattle, and it was a lifestyle where they didn't want people with personalities like me. I generally tend to joke around a lot, and that just isn't what they want in the larger markets. So instead of making six figures in large markets, I came here intentionally because I wanted to have quality of life, and for me, quality of life is ultimately where mental health comes out from. So that's my story, and I would like to answer any questions if you have any.
You're an excellent speaker. Thank you very much. What's the best concert you've been to?
Best concert?
Yeah, you're a musician. What concert really floated your boat?
Well, I can say, there was one concert, this band Pearl Jam, that became quite big. Before they were big, I saw them in like a 1,400 seat place. And at one point, the lead singer body surfed out into the crowd and then climbed up on the walls, and all of a sudden figured out he couldn't get back down to the crowd, so he did remember the Nestea plunge? Nestea plunged into the crowd while the band was still jamming, and that was just like, you know, my head exploded. But what I will say is, the band I've seen the most is Carlos Santana. I saw him when I was recovering from this depression when I was going to music school, and he played this music, and he talked about, you know, the spirit of Bob Marley and Jimi Hendrix, and how, you know, love is why we're here. And, you know, I was like, whoa, this is absolutely fantastic. And so every time he came in concert, it was something I had to go see. And then finally, the other one that I just dropped $300 and some odd on is Alison Krauss coming with Robert Plant to the Hayden Amphitheater. But if Alison Krauss gets anywhere near me, I drop as much money as I can on any ticket that I can.
Good choice.
Anything else? Yeah.
You said that you were teaching kids meteorology.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell them more about that? Or?
Yes, I love it. I started out teaching kids in Anchorage. It was just part of the job. We'd go out and teach young kids, and I don't have any kids of my own, but my parents were both teachers. And one of the teachers there said, I don't know why it is. I like teaching kids meteorology. She goes, that's because you're as fascinated with meteorology as a fourth grader. And you are still, and it's still true. Like, I mean, I look out at the clouds, and meteorology was probably one of the most spiritual things I ever learned. And I studied the Tao Te Ching, I studied Buddhism, I studied Hinduism, I studied everything. But I can look out into the sky and know what's happening. And I've studied the earth and the intricacies of it all. And so it really is, I'm still as excited as I ever have been. During COVID days, you know, everyone started going online. And so I went to a thing called OutSchool, which is a website for web teachers, and taught space and taught meteorology to kids, mainly around 11, 12 years old, younger kids that part of my job really is to take a very intricate science and relate it to people in very simple terms. So to me, that really works well for teaching kids. And if you bring up volcanoes and dinosaurs, you instantly get kids sucked into learning about meteorology. One of the kids I had in this last class I taught, her mother is a producer for Discovery Channel, and I swear this little girl is going to be the next head of NASA, partially because I did a class called Spaces for Girls, and we did a whole study on women and how they've affected NASA and all that. So I don't like teaching online that much. It's not very fun, but to the kids, just love seeing them. Well, they listen to me. The teachers, they don't always listen to, whereas when they see the guy that they see in the morning, they tend to actually listen to what I have to say.
Will you still try to do that, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With COVID, obviously, we ran into some problems, but
Right.
I've been telling my bosses, like, as soon as it comes out, we're basically ready to start firing up again.
That'd be cool. I have that same geek interest in looking at the sky.
Nice.
Geek for my guy.
Maybe you could have a session for adults.
I know.
It's my excitement level. I really can say that it hasn't waned at all. In fact, the more you learn about thermodynamics, and this is all stuff like, to me, I didn't take calculus. I had to learn calculus. I'm a horrible mathematician. But what I have a gift for now is that I'm a right brain person. So I have to see things. And at one time in my life, I began to see science, which is like my best friend can see numbers, not me. I can see thermodynamic processes in my head. I can visualize these things. And so when I see a fair-weather cumulus cloud, I can know what's causing that cloud, why it's there. When it's an overcast day, I can say this is what's happening. And in meteorology, it's not us science. It's a lot of sciences. It's oceanography, hydrology, it's geology, geography. So you learn all about the Earth. And so I just feel more tied into the Earth because of having studied that.
So it's interesting. As you guys may know, I'm not a Bendite. I don't look like a Bendite. I came from Southern California. And whenever I say Oregon, they just think of it as always wet and overcast.
Yeah.
But they don't know Central Oregon, where our Chamber of Commerce in Bend says 300 days of sunshine.
Right.
So what explains the 300 days of sunshine in Central Oregon versus the ideology of it being overcast and raining in the rest of the other country, or part of the...
Well, first of all, I'll take issue with 300 days of sunshine a year. I think that's a Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
I'd put it at 285.
Okay.
So one of the aspects of meteorology is, we have all of our weather comes off the ocean. So it's already got some moisture in it. And when it is forced to rise, when air is forced to rise, it gets colder. And as it gets colder, it condenses. So as it's getting pushed up over the mountains, it will turn into condensation and then turn into either rain or snow, depending. Obviously, I was offered a job in Eugene, and I was like, oh God, no, not again. I've been west of the mountains, I'm not going back. That's why you get so much rain on that one side. When it comes to the other side, so as it raises up, it condenses and falls on one side. As it goes down, it actually gets compressed on the other side of the mountain, so then it heats up, so it dries out. So now you've got a couple of different things. I don't know if you've ever heard of like a Chinook wind, or you'll get air that comes down off a mountain, and they used to call them, natives used to call them snow eaters, and in Alaska we had multiple names for them, but air will come down off the mountains and it's much warmer on the other side, so it just can absolutely melt snow off. So we get what we call a rain shadow effect from that. It makes it extremely difficult to, of course, forecast, because I forecasted in Seattle, mountain range, Alaska, mountain range. Weather, when it hits mountains, changes completely. So depending on where a system comes in, it can have very, very different effects. But you know what? I mean, I'm the first one to say I'm glad we've had this spring, even though I didn't need the rain, but I'm perfectly happy for it. But I really love the sunshine. That's why I came here. So the rain shadow is a friend for me. Yeah.
Over the years, probably like many of us, we make fun of weather forecasts, and yeah, sure.
Right.
But I've noticed over the last couple of years, there's more accuracy, and it's if it's just me, but I'll look at my phone in the morning and get the hourly forecast for the day. And it's amazing how some days it's right on the spot, hour by hour.
Right.
So how do they predict that accuracy?
I've seen the difference because I was out of weather for about 9 years. And the forecast model accuracy has just, well, we have more resolution now. Far more data. One of the things that most people think about, I didn't even think about it until I was in Anchorage because it's a lot of airplanes in Alaska. Well, now we have temperature, moisture, all these readings on airplanes. So whereas before we only had a few buoys off in the ocean, which would give us data, and then a few stations on the coast and things like that. Well, now we have all these temperature readings from different elevations from airplanes, and we also have supercomputers. Literally, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm 90% sure the biggest supercomputers in the country are at the National Weather Service. They're massive computers that crunch the data. Now, of course, the hard part is, like, for me, when people say, what's your favorite weather app? I say, none of them. I'm not a big fan of any of the weather forecasts I see online. I look at them all the time. And I'm also, weather takes an interpreter. And it takes somebody, in my opinion, this is be different for other people, a lot of forecasters get stuck in the data, just the numbers. They go, oh, well, this is what's supposed to happen because that's what the numbers say. And I'm a right brain scientist, so I go, oh, I've seen this hit before, I've seen how this works, and my weather almost comes out of a gut feeling more than it does out of data. But oh my God, the forecast model that we have now, we didn't have that when I did it in 2005, 2010. The forecast models are getting to be really reliable. Not always, that's why it's good to have a person who can interpret it, but the amount of data that we have is just exponentially larger, and of course the ability to process is going way up.
Well, it's not just from weather balloons. There's
Right.
aircraft.
Yeah.
That thought just came on mind. Maybe we're running low on time here, but why don't we hear that our weather forecasting comes out of Pendleton?
That's where the National Weather Service headquarters for our region is.
So that's where you get your information?
Off the record, I'm not a big fan. I don't find them to be greatly accurate. I look at their forecasts every day. They tend to run a bit cold, and they tend to run a bit sunny. But a lot of other forecasts tend to run a bit cloudy and run a bit warm. So it's a really weird situation. The Weather Service is one of the examples of where I think they get a lot of young people that come out of meteorology school and they just look at the numbers. So you'll get in the ballpark with them, but I'd like to think that I can out-forecast them usually.
Scott? Oh, sorry.
I'd like to ask a question about that terrible event that occurred to you. And did you ever find out why you were fired?
Because I had a dissenting opinion.
That'll do it.
Yes.
Okay.
I usually voice it. That's the other problem.
Of course.
Perfect. Please let me know if you do a weather class for adults and
Absolutely.
kids.
Yeah.
I geek out on this. I'd love to be like, cumulus, nimbus. I can't remember one of us. But thank you for coming as a little token of appreciation. We had some handmade. I think this is a Western juniper pen. So thank you for coming to speak.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Sharing. Okay, with that, it looks like it's still sunny, right? We will adjourn. We'll see you next week at
The high school.
Redmond High School. Please get with Michelle to confirm we need that.